What happens when the enemy isn't across an ocean or protected by a border, but it is right next door? Civil wars are some of the most brutal conflicts humanity has ever witnessed, and are civil in name only. They don't just tear countries apart, they can impact the entire world. And we're about to reveal some of the deadliest and most influential of all time on today's episode of the Infographics Show. Civil wars so violent they changed history forever. Number 10. Caesar's Civil War. In 50 BC, there were very few people in the world as powerful as Julius Caesar. At the time, Rome wasn't even an empire yet. It was a republic ruled by a senate instead of a singular figurehead. Caesar was a highly accomplished and revered military leader, especially after his victories in subduing Gaul, a 10-year invasion into a region comprising what is now modern-day France, parts of western Germany, and Belgium. Soldiers who fought under him weren't loyal to Rome or the army they were part of, they were loyal to Caesar. During his conquest, Caesar had been using his growing wealth and the addition of the loot he took from his new position as the Roman governor of Gaul to hire political agents to improve his position of power back home. He might not have been the first emperor of Rome, but he wanted to be. The problem was his aspirations were opposed by other prominent Roman figures who happened to not be overly keen on Rome becoming an empire. Most notably, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, also known as Pompey. The tensions between those two boiled over in 49 BC when Pompey and his allies within the Roman Senate demanded that Caesar turn over his provinces and armies. Then, in arguably one of history's worst acts of malicious compliance, Caesar marched his soldiers across the Rubicon River and illegally entered the heart of Roman territory. And this sparked an all-out civil war. Roman legions outfitted with swords, javelins, and shields faced off against each other, those soldiers loyal to Caesar against those fighting for the Republic. What followed were nearly 5 years of Caesar systematically wiping out the Senate's armies, including those led by Pompey. There might have been civil wars with steeper body counts, which we'll get to soon, but there is no denying the impact Caesar's civil war had on Europe. It reshaped the entire continent, causing the spread of the Roman language, along with their laws and technology. It also signaled the end of the Roman Republic. Caesar had set in motion a chain of events that would see the Republic replaced with a new system headed by hereditary monarchs, an emperor whose rule was passed on to an appointed successor. Just a shame that the original Caesar was assassinated by his own former friends before he could see the result of his warmongering. Julius Caesar's civil war reshaped Rome. Centuries later, England faced its own reckoning. Number 9. The English Civil War. The English Civil War wasn't just a singular conflict, it was a series of brutal wars that were fought between 1642 and 1651. And while it might have looked like any other war at first glance, with pikes, cannons, cavalry, and the emergence of gunpowder, it was anything but typical. Because unlike earlier wars fought between rival kings over land or titles, this war was different. This time it was personal. Fueled by outrage over King Charles I's unpopular taxes and autocratic rule, the war didn't pit nations against each other, it tore England apart from within. Opposing sides clashed over political and religious beliefs. On one side were the Royalists, who, as their name suggests, were on the side of continuing the monarchy. They wanted their sovereign ruler to have unchecked power and wealth accrued through taxation. In opposition, the Parliamentarians, who saw more of a balance of power between Parliament and the king. They rose up and battled the Royalists in the First English Civil War. The supporters of Parliament secured victory, taking the king into custody and forcing his son, also called Charles, into exile. What followed was the Parliamentarians establishing the Commonwealth of England, a short-lived republic, the only time in history that England has ever been one. The Royalists were defeated again in the Second English Civil War of 1648, and Charles I was executed a year later. But the new Commonwealth was unsustainable thanks to political divisions within the Parliamentarians. Charles II would be crowned King of Scotland, leading to the Anglo-Scottish War, which the Parliamentarians won yet again in 1651. Overall, the Royalists lost well over 50,000 troops, while the Parliamentarians only suffered just over 34,000 casualties. With both Ireland and Scotland incorporated into the Commonwealth, the British Isles became a unitary state, and what followed was the creation of a constitutional monarchy, which has continued to this day. This means that Parliament still has all the power, but the monarch can still exercise some authority, so long as it's in line with the country's constitution. And that is where the English Civil War really left its mark on history. It helped shape the English Constitution, which in turn would determine the laws of the early United States of America, eventually leading to the American Revolutionary War just over 100 years later in the 1770s. We'll get onto the US's very own Civil War in a moment, but before that, we're staying in Europe for a conflict that teed up one of the worst events in all of human history. Number 8. The Spanish Civil War. In 1936, authoritarian right-wing General Francisco Franco led a military coup against Spain's Republican government. When Franco failed to take control of Spain, conservative elements within the country turned their support to his efforts, inciting a bitter conflict between them and the Spanish Republicans. But here is how the Civil War changed history. These rebels, or nationalists as they were called, received support and aid directly from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. This turned Spain into a controlled testing environment for the warfare both the Nazis and Fascist Italy would go on to enact during World War II. Nazi forces that were sent to Spain in support of Franco and the nationalists carried out massive aerial bombardments, the kind the Luftwaffe would deploy against the Allied forces a few years later. While the Spanish Civil War was nowhere near as deadly as the Second World War, there were still significant casualties, with an estimated death toll of 250,000 people. This conflict reshaped modern Spain too. In 1939, Francisco Franco was installed as a dictator and managed to remain in power for decades, all the way up to 1975. It's a horrifying reminder of what could happen when militant far-right groups don't face significant or effective opposition. Now, for everyone in our US audience who's been waiting for it. Number 7. The American Civil War. While the Spanish Civil War was a prelude to the horrors of World War II, the American Civil War showcased to the world what warfare would look like in the Industrial Age. It paved the way for the First World War through the use of artillery, railway supply lines, breech-loaded rifles, and a level of destruction that had never been seen before at the time. The incitement of the American Civil War came about in 1861, when a number of Southern states sought to preserve the institution of slavery. They rejected the growing abolitionist movement, claiming that slavery was a state right and that the federal government shouldn't be able to abolish the barbaric practice. These states seceded from the Union in response to the election of President Abraham Lincoln, forming the Confederate States of America. When the Confederates opened fire on a United States fort, they had fired the first shot in what had become the American Civil War. Around 23 states fought, with most of the action taking place in Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi, and along the Mississippi River. There were also naval engagements that took place along the Atlantic coast. Exact figures vary, but it's estimated that the Union, made up of northern and some western states, lost about 360,000 soldiers, while the Confederacy suffered around 260,000 to 290,000 deaths. When including the wounded and soldiers missing in action, that number rises dramatically. The Union secured victory in 1865, leading to the abolishment of slavery. Meanwhile, the southern states were reincorporated into the Union, dissolving the Confederacy. Though the American Civil War had also led to the assassination of President Lincoln, it resulted in the United States establishing a much stronger federal government with various different branches. Civil wars are already pretty deadly, but what happens when you add in an extra explosive element to a nation's conflict? Number 6. The Vietnam War. Vietnam wasn't just a civil war between nationalist South Vietnam and the communist-controlled North, but also a proxy war of the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union. Prior to the war, Vietnam had been part of the French colony of Indochina and eventually fought to secure their independence from France, with the head of a guerrilla army, Ho Chi Minh, successfully forcing France out of Vietnam. This led to a partition of the country into two halves in 1954. Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnam, or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, were primarily communist, and they wanted to completely drive out any foreign influences over the country. They wanted communism to become the governing political ideology throughout all of Vietnam. However, they were opposed by the nationalists of South Vietnam, also known as the Republic of Vietnam, headed up by a corrupt government. In 1955, civil war broke out between the two nations, but it wouldn't just be North Vietnam versus South Vietnam for long. Given their opposition to communism on a worldwide scale, the United States provided support to South Vietnam, along with other anti-communist countries. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and China backed the communist Vietnamese in the north. In 1965, the U.S. became directly engaged with the Vietnam Civil War, fighting alongside South Vietnamese troops against the Viet Cong guerrilla fighters in the north. But America quickly learned the hard way that they were pretty outmatched against fighters who knew how to use Vietnam's topography against them. The Viet Cong were fighting back using asymmetric tactics that the U.S. just wasn't prepared for. America ended up losing hundreds of thousands of troops, and Vietnam quickly became one of the deadliest conflicts of the entire Cold War. It not only changed the future of the country and those around it, but also led to a historical disgrace for the United States military. The U.S. would eventually give up, pulling out of Vietnam in 1975. The fighting also had spilled over into Laos and Cambodia, who were also experiencing instability thanks to their own civil wars. By the end of it, all three countries, including Vietnam, were under communist control. An estimated 3 million people lost their lives as a result, although it wasn't just the incredibly high death toll that meant Vietnam left its mark on history. In the US, military involvement in Vietnam was widely unpopular, especially among the more countercultural sides of the political left, who advocated for peace. Vietnam still serves as a widely cited case in political debates against the idea of interventionist military action, even half a century after America pulled out of Nam. But surely few other civil wars could outpace the loss of life and lasting impact of Vietnam, right? Wrong. Number 5. The Nigerian Civil War. While it might have only lasted a few years, the Nigerian Civil War was no less bloody. Beginning on July 6, 1967, the main conflict was incited by ethnic and economic inequality faced by the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria. At the time, Nigeria had just gained independence from colonial British rule in 1960. The region was already fraught with long-standing stresses like ethnic competitiveness, educational inequality, and economic imbalance. And this was only worsened as Nigeria was formally decolonized up until 1963. Following military coups that attempted to take control of the Nigerian federal government, it was ruled that the Igbo people were to be classified as second-class citizens. It resulted in a series of anti-Igbo pogroms, a coordinated massacre targeting a specific ethnic or religious group. The surviving Igbos, realizing that the Nigerian federal government weren't going to protect them, seceded from the rest of the country to form the independent state of Biafra. Biafra had access to large oil-producing areas in Port Harcourt, which served as their trade outlet with the rest of the world. The Nigerian federal government went to war with them, and with the backing of much of the international community, mainly the United Kingdom and Soviet Union, Biafra needed to rely on the support of foreign mercenaries to bolster their armed forces. Uncharacteristically, the United States opted to remain neutral, though they considered Nigeria to still be Britain's responsibility despite the decolonization. Much like Vietnam, the Nigerian Civil War made a mark on history by being one of the first human conflicts to be televised. Western countries saw plenty of images of Biafran children starving as a result of the war, resulting in a significant rise in funding toward international non-governmental organizations to provide Biafra with humanitarian aid. It was the Biafran Airlift, a humanitarian effort to transport food and medicine to Biafra, that inspired the formation of Doctors Without Borders. Sadly, though, there's a reason that Biafra no longer exists as an independent state. The Nigerian Civil War saw around 100,000 Biafrans killed in the fighting. Millions more died from starvation and disease caused by Nigeria's efforts to isolate Biafra, cutting them off from the rest of the world. With the lack of revenue from their oil, Biafrans became impoverished, eventually being forced to surrender in 1970, when the state was absorbed back into Nigeria. By the end of it, between 500,000 to as many as 3 million people died in under 3 years. And just like that, we're back to some United States military intervention in a civil war that is, well, technically still not over. Number 4. The Korean War. When the dust settled after the Second World War, the country of Korea had been partitioned into 2 occupation zones. The north was controlled by the Soviet Union, who established a communist government there. This meant that North and South Korea were now separately controlled states. And just like in Vietnam, by the time the Cold War came around, each of these sides ended up being backed by either the USA or the USSR. By the 50s, North Korea was under the control of dictator Kim Il-sung. And with the support of China and the Soviets, he wanted to reunify Korea by any means necessary. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean People's Army crossed the international border with South Korea, kicking off a chain reaction that led to the Korean War. The United States, on behalf of the government of South Korea, launched a military intervention, while the Soviets and China did the same in support of the North. What puts the Korean War so high up on the list, though, is just how deadly it was, especially by modern standards. The military losses in Korea were exceptionally high, with several million people dying on the Korean peninsula, an area that is only about the same size as the entire state of Utah. Nearly 1 million South Koreans died during the war, just under 5% of the entire population, with North Korea losing slightly more at 1.5 million, thanks to aerial bombings carried out by America and the Allied forces. They lost between 10 to 15% of their population, which is a higher percentage than the losses suffered by the Soviet Union during World War II. Another combined million were suffered in military losses by North Korea and China, losing approximately 110,000 in fighting with a further 380,000 wounded. South Korea, or the Republic of Korea, lost almost 138,000 troops, with 33,000 of America's soldiers also dying. Overall, the losses resulted in an estimated death toll of around 3 million soldiers and civilians. The whole thing ended in a stalemate, with both North and South Korea still existing as independent partitioned states to this day, meaning technically, this particular civil war has never formally ended. 3 million is a lot, but things can always still get even deadlier, like a war that claimed an average of 3,000 lives per day for 5 whole years. Number 3. The Second Congo War. Not only one of the deadliest conflicts in modern African history, the Second Congo War was also overall one of the deadliest wars of the 21st century. While it started in 1998, the roots of this civil war can be traced back to a series of events, including the Rwandan genocide, the death of Zairian President Mobutu Sese Seko, and the ethnic tensions between the Hutu and Tutsi people. A year prior to the Second Congo War, a rebellion led by Laurent Kabila deposed Mobutu, renaming what was then known as Zaire to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. However, Kabila would soon find himself at odds with some of the same forces that had helped elevate him to power. When Rwanda attempted to curb anti-government forces in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, fighting started to expand and ended up involving several other African countries. What makes the Second Congo War so significant and gave it such a high body count was the fact that it drew in other African nations. Angola, Namibia, Chad, Sudan, and Zimbabwe all supported Kabila and the government forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Meanwhile, rebel troops were aided by soldiers from Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda. In total, the armies of 9 different countries, along with 20 different armed militia groups affiliated with them, ended up fighting for territory and for control of natural mineral deposits. These included resources like gold, diamonds, and wolframite, which is a source of tungsten. The estimated worth of all of these resources was around $24 trillion. Over a period of 5 years, the Second Congo War claimed the lives of around 5.4 million people. As is the case in a lot of civil wars on this list, a significant portion of those casualties were civilians. Genocides and other atrocities committed by armed groups contributed to the high civilian death toll. Disease and malnutrition that were a direct result of the war were also largely to blame. Foreign missionaries and humanitarian aid workers were also caught in the intense violence, as were a significant number of children. After the assassination of Laurent Kabila, he was succeeded by his son Joseph, who wanted a peaceful resolution, but that wouldn't come easy. Both the Rwandan and Ugandan governments argued about a United Nations proposal to pull their troops from the Congo. But this was never fully actualized. It wouldn't be until December of 2002 that an agreement was reached, allowing for an end to the conflict the following year. Long before the Congo erupted into bloodshed, this next nation had already been through its own nightmare. Number 2. The Chinese Civil War. While Europe was dealing with the fallout of World War I, over in China the government-backed Kuomintang was attempting to prevent a revolutionary uprising by the Communist Party of China. The early phases of this civil war, starting all the way back in 1927, were more like an insurgency, with the Chinese Communist forces trying to topple the nationalist government. And initially, things weren't looking good for the Communist Party of China. They only managed to escape being completely wiped out by making their way to the relative safety of the Shaanxi province. But they ended up getting a big break when a certain other conflict took precedence: the Second World War. Fighting between the Kuomintang and the Communists was suspended in 1937 so that both sides could combine their efforts to defend against a Japanese invasion. This gave the Communist Party of China a way to win against their nationalist rivals. In 1946, during the aftermath of World War II, Soviet Union forces in both Manchuria and Korea handed over confiscated Japanese weaponry and their own surplus arms to the Communist forces, now led by Mao Zedong. With this additional firepower, the Chinese Civil War was back on, and the nationalists were forced off the mainland, evacuating to the island of Taiwan. Once there, they established themselves as the Republic of China, while the communist government controlled the mainland as the People's Republic of China. By the end of the war in 1950, various massacres and atrocities that both sides had been involved in had led to the deaths of almost 9 million people. This victory by the Communist Party of China directly led to China as we know it today, which is still controlled by the Central Committee of the modern Communist Party. Taiwan also still remains an independent country after the surviving nationalists evacuated there. Interestingly, this is another civil war that's not really been settled and could yet lead to another full-blown global conflict in the future. Now we've come to the most violent civil war that steeped the history of one country in so much blood and changed history forever just through the sheer body count alone. Number 1. The Russian Civil War. During the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, managed to overthrow the country's provisional government. But rather than a smooth transition of power, what followed were years of bloody civil war. Various opposing political factions, a lot of them more conservative, attempted to push back against the incumbent Bolsheviks. Most of the opposition allied together to form what would become known as the White Army, fighting with the Bolshevik Red Army for control over Russia. The country even ended up pulling their army out of the First World War in order to deal with the worsening internal conflict. The White Army received extensive support from outside international influences, not just other countries in Europe, but also the US. But it wasn't enough to enable them to topple the Bolsheviks, who managed to retain their power after 5 years of civil war against the White Army. After the conflict concluded in 1922, the Bolsheviks were able to transform what had once been the Russian Empire into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or as it would later become known, the Soviet Union. The estimated death toll of the Russian Civil War was between 7 and 12 million casualties, a vast majority of whom were civilians. Civil wars leave deep scars, but few compare to the devastation of Vietnam. Discover the shocking details and 50 insane facts about the Vietnam War you didn't know, or click on this video instead.